We need to get that fire under control before it spreads to the fuel tanks.
The deafening roar of engines on fire mixed with the sharp scream of metal tearing apart. Charlie Brown was dying. He knew it. Each breath was a blade cutting through his lungs through the cracked oxygen mask. The smell of kerosene and blood flooded the shattered cockpit of the B-17 bomber. His fingers trembled over the controls, slipping on his own blood dripping from his face lacerated by shrapnel. Through the black smoke, he saw the deadly silhouette approaching. The Japanese fighter with its wings painted blood red, the rising sun shining like a death sentence. "It's over," Charlie whispered, closing his eyes. But then, nothing. No gunfire, no final explosion, only impossible silence cutting through the chaos. When he opened his eyes again, the enemy was there, flying beside him so close he could see the pilot's face through the glass. And in that moment, something happened that would defy everything the world believed about war, hatred, and humanity. Something that should never have happened. Something that would change 2 lives forever. But it would cost one man everything he had, his honor, his homeland, his very existence. At the exact moment you believe you know the limits of human nature, a story emerges from the shadows of history and shatters all your certainties. We're about to dive into one of the most extraordinary and disturbing episodes of World War II, an event so improbable that it remained buried for decades, hidden not by conspiracy, but by pure disbelief. Because when a man chooses compassion in the midst of hell, when he risks everything to save his enemy, the world simply doesn't know what to do with that truth. The story you're about to learn isn't about conventional heroism. It's about that impossible moment when humanity whispers louder than the roar of war. It's about 2 men who should never have met, and a gesture that would cost one of them his very identity. But before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Your presence here carries a purpose. This content reached you at the right time. Prepare yourself, because what happened in the skies over the Philippine Sea in December 1942 shouldn't be possible. And yet, it happened. December 20th, 1942. The sky over Bremen, Germany was painted with black smoke and incandescent tracers. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown commanded his B-17 bomber, nicknamed Ye Olde Pub, on his first combat mission over enemy territory. He was just a kid, 21 years old, eyes still shining with that dangerous mixture of courage and naivety that war hadn't yet ripped from him. The mission was simple on paper: bomb a German submarine factory and return home. But nothing is simple when hell decides to claim its share. The bomber formation had crossed hostile territory, dropped its deadly cargo, and begun the return when the nightmare started. German Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt fighters appeared like furious wasps, tearing through the sky with their machine guns. One by one, the B-17s around Charlie began to fall, fireballs spiraling down, leaving trails of black smoke like epitaphs written in the sky. The radio exploded with desperate screams, contradictory orders, pleas for help that no one could offer. Then it happened. A 20mm shell pierced the nose of Ye Olde Pub like a hot knife through butter. The explosion tore away half the cockpit, transforming metal into shrapnel that flew like assassin's blades. Charlie felt something hot running down his face. Blood. He didn't know if it was his or the navigator's sitting next to him. The bomber shook violently, losing altitude, the engines screaming in mechanical agony. Through the acrid smoke invading his lungs, Charlie saw the horror around him. The navigator was slumped over the controls, motionless. The top turret gunner hung limp, his position destroyed by a direct burst. Man-sized holes pierced the fuselage, transforming the plane into an aluminum sieve, flying at 400 kilometers per hour. The freezing wind of high altitude whistled through the cracks, freezing the blood staining the interior surfaces. But the worst was still to come. A second German fighter dove from behind, its weapons spitting death. Charlie felt the impacts running through the entire bomber structure. Thump, 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 like a giant heart beating its last pulse. Engine number 2 exploded in orange flames. The tail rudder was practically torn off. The hydraulic system failed, leaving the controls heavy as lead in his trembling hands. They were falling. Slowly, inexorably, Ye Old Pub began its final descent. Charlie fought the controls, every muscle in his body screaming with effort. Around him, what remained of the crew moved like ghosts in slow motion. Some wounded, others in shock, all aware they were living their last minutes. The bomber formation had disappeared, over the horizon, leaving them completely alone over enemy territory. No Allied fighters to protect them, no hope of rescue, just the hostile sky and German soil waiting below like an open grave. And then, when Charlie thought it couldn't get worse, he saw the deadly silhouette approaching from the right. Franz Stiegler was everything Charlie Brown was not. At 27 years old, the German pilot was an experienced Luftwaffe veteran with 16 confirmed kills on his record. He was only 4 victories away from the Ritterkreuz, the Reich's Knight's Cross, the highest decoration a pilot could receive. 4 victories that would separate him from eternal glory, that would engrave his name in German aviation history. And there, stumbling through the sky like a bird with broken wings, was his 17th victory on a silver platter. Franz had just landed to refuel when he saw the solitary bomber passing low over the airfield. Something in that sight awakened his hunter's instinct, that primitive reflex that separates aces from common pilots. Without asking permission, he immediately took off in his Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's deadliest fighter. The 350 horsepower of the Daimler-Benz engine roared as he climbed in pursuit. It was a matter of seconds until he caught his prey. The protocol was clear, brutal, efficient. Approach from behind, aim at the cockpit, squeeze the trigger, watch the enemy explode. Simple, clean, necessary. Franz had done this 16 times before. Each kill was a small revenge for what the Allies had done to his land, his family, his people. Each enemy pilot killed was one less bomber pouring fire over German cities, over defenseless women and children. He approached from the B-17's tail, his finger caressing the trigger of the MG-17 machine guns. The distance decreased rapidly. 300 meters, 200, 100, perfect range, perfect angle. Target perfectly exposed and defenseless. But then Franz saw. And what he saw froze his finger over the trigger. The American bomber wasn't just damaged. It was a walking miracle of destruction. Enormous holes pierced the fuselage from end to end. The tail hung at an unnatural angle, held only by twisted metal wires. The nose glass was completely destroyed, leaving the interior exposed to the cutting wind. And through those holes, Franz could see human figures moving, some helping wounded comrades, others simply clinging to anything solid, trying to survive. He flew even closer, so close he could see faces. A wounded gunner stared at him through an opening in the fuselage, not with hatred, not with defiance, but with that empty expression Franz knew all too well. It was the look of a man who had already accepted death and was just waiting for it to arrive. In that moment, something broke inside Franz Stiegler. Or perhaps something reassembled. Some piece of his humanity that war had tried to crush, but hadn't managed to completely destroy. He remembered the words of his commander, the legendary Gustav Röttl, repeated countless times during training. "If I ever see you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you down myself." The message was clear. There were rules, even in war. There were lines that a man of honor didn't cross. And that shattered bomber, those wounded men fighting just to stay alive, were essentially the same thing as parachutists descending defenseless. Wounded navigator away from the destroyed nose and was trying to stop the bleeding with strips torn from his own clothing. These men had trusted their lives to him. These men depended on his decision now. Charlie shook his head negatively at the German pilot. No, he wouldn't land in Germany. They would go home or die trying. Franz Stiegler saw the refusal and for a moment considered forcing the issue. He could fire at the wings, at the landing gear, force the bomber down. It would be for their own safety. But he also recognized something in that stubborn gesture of the American pilot, the same fierce pride, the same irrational loyalty to comrades that he himself carried. It was the universal language of warriors, spoken without words across generations and beyond borders. So Franz did something even more extraordinary. Instead of forcing the landing or simply leaving, he remained beside the battered bomber. He adjusted his speed to match the mortally wounded B-17, reducing to a dangerous 250 kilometers per hour, speed at which the Messerschmitt could barely maintain lift. And he began to escort them, not as predator, but as protector. The coast was less than 50 kilometers away, but it might as well have been the distance to the moon. The territory below swarmed with German anti-aircraft batteries, each eager to shoot down any enemy aircraft that came within range. And there was no shortage of other Luftwaffe fighters patrolling, looking for easy targets exactly like ye old pub. But now that crippled bomber had an unlikely guardian. When German anti-aircraft gunners prepared their weapons to fire at the B-17, they hesitated, seeing the Messerschmitt flying in tight formation beside it. It was confusing. It was against all rules of engagement. What the hell was that German pilot doing? Franz knew exactly what he was doing and committing treason. Each passing second escorting the enemy was another layer of disobedience, another step toward court-martial, another dive into the abyss of military dishonor. If discovered, there would be no excuses, no justifications that would save him. In Germany of 1942, helping the enemy wasn't just a crime. It was treason punishable by execution. But Franz kept flying. The minutes dragged like hours. The B-17's number 2 engine continued spitting flames, leaving a trail of black smoke that could be seen for kilometers. The tail rudder hung at an increasingly precarious angle. Altitude continued dropping. 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. Charlie fought the controls like a man trying to tame a wild bull, each movement a desperate negotiation with physics and luck. Then, like a miracle emerging through the fog, the coast appeared. The thin line between land and sea, between enemy territory and the relative salvation of the North Sea. They were almost there. Almost. Franz knew it was time to leave. Staying longer would be absolute madness, but something kept him there. Perhaps morbid curiosity to see if those brave men would actually make it. Perhaps the need to witness the end of the story he had begun. They crossed the coast. The gray and tempestuous sea stretched below, cold and deadly. But it was neutral territory. Territory where the American bomber could, theoretically, survive. Franz looked one last time at the American pilot. Their eyes met through the glass and distance. Two men who should never have met, united by an impossible moment of humanity amid the inhumanity of war. Then Franz Stiegler saluted. It wasn't a military salute. It wasn't a gesture of respect between enemies. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that they had shared something that transcended war, that touched the core of what it meant to be human. Charlie Brown watched in astonishment as the German fighter turned abruptly and disappeared back toward the coast. For several seconds, no one on Ye Olde pub spoke. It was as if everyone was simultaneously processing something their brains refused to accept as real. What the hell had just happened? The flight engineer was the first to break the silence. Did anyone else see that, or did I hit my head too hard? Nervous laughter echoed through the intercom. That kind of hysterical laugh that comes after you escape death by a thread so thin it's invisible. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Ye Olde pub was still flying by pure stubbornness, each additional minute in the air defying all laws of engineering. They needed to reach England. It was 200 kilometers across the North Sea. 200 kilometers that could be an eternity. Charlie kept the bomber as low as possible, practically grazing the churning waves. Low altitude helped maintain cabin pressure and reduced fuel consumption from the surviving engine. But it also meant any mistake would be fatal. There was no room for recovery. Fuel was running out. The gauges showed dangerously low levels, but Charlie knew the indicators could be lying. The measurement system had been damaged along with everything else. They were flying blind, trusting only hope and momentum. 70 kilometers from the coast. 50. 30. England emerged through the fog like a divine vision. Those white cliffs that millions of men had learned to love as a symbol of safety, of home, of life. Charlie didn't wait for permission or coordinates. As soon as he spotted land, he began looking for any flat field where he could put that destroyed machine on the ground. A secondary airstrip appeared. Small, rudimentary, but solid. Ye Old Pub descended in an approach that defied all procedures with one dead engine, destroyed control surfaces and landing gear that barely responded. Charlie had no idea if the wheels would lower, if the brakes would work, if the whole thing wouldn't disintegrate the moment of impact. The bomber touched the runway like a baby being placed in a cradle, surprisingly smooth considering the circumstances. But then the right wheel gave way. The wing scraped the asphalt in a festival of sparks, and the plane spun violently before finally stopping in a cloud of dust and smoke. Silence. A silence so profound that Charlie could hear his own heart hammering against his ribs. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the crew exploded into life, laughing, crying, hugging, screaming in pure relief. They were alive. Impossible, improbable, miraculously alive. When RAF officers inspected the damage, they were incredulous. Ye Olde Pub had received more than 200 projectile impacts. The tail was held by less than 30 centimeters of intact metal. Enormous holes allowed seeing completely through the fuselage. One of the inspectors murmured, "This plane shouldn't be flying, it's physically impossible." But it had flown, and it had brought 10 men back home. During the debriefing, Charlie told his story, including the part about the German pilot who had escorted them. The intelligence officers exchanged uncomfortable looks. One of them finally spoke. "Lieutenant Brown, I strongly advise you not to include that part in your official report." Charlie didn't understand. "Why? It's what happened." The officer sighed. "Because no one will believe it. And even if they do, it'll create complicated questions. Why would an enemy pilot help you? Are you omitting something? Was there collaboration?" The implication was clear as crystal. In wartime, enemy mercy wasn't seen as nobility, it was seen as suspicion. If Charlie insisted on the story, he would be interrogated extensively. His loyalty would be questioned. His military career could be destroyed by an act of honesty about an act of humanity. So Charlie Brown did what he was told to do. He omitted the German pilot from the official report. He wrote that they had escaped by luck and favorable weather conditions. Empty words that transformed a human miracle into mere statistical chance. While Charlie Brown buried his story under layers of obligatory silence, Franz Stiegler faced his own demons. He had landed back at the German base expecting to be arrested immediately. He was certain someone had seen, someone had reported, that the court-martial was waiting. But nothing happened. No one mentioned the American bomber. No one asked questions. It was as if those crucial minutes simply hadn't existed. Franz kept his mouth shut. He didn't tell his fellow pilots, didn't mention it to his superiors, didn't record it in his flight log. That extraordinary event became his best-kept secret, a time bomb of treason that could explode at any moment if the truth emerged. But silence had a price. Each night, Franz saw that shattered bomber in his dreams, saw the faces of those wounded men through the holes in the fuselage, heard the roar of engines, felt the freezing wind, relived that impossible moment of decision, and wondered, obsessively, if those men had survived. He never received his Ritterkreuz. He finished the war with 28 confirmed kills, more than enough for the decoration. But something always blocked the recommendations. Perhaps someone knew. Perhaps someone suspected. Or perhaps the universe simply understood that Franz had already received something more valuable than any medal. The certainty that he had preserved his humanity when it would have been much easier to lose it. When the war ended, Franz emigrated to Canada, trying to leave the memories behind. He built a new life, a new identity, a new future. But that moment over the North Sea never left him. It was like a melody stuck in his head, playing eternally in the background. Charlie Brown, meanwhile, completed 29 more combat missions. He survived the war, returned home, built a career. He became successful in business, married, had children. A perfectly normal American life. Except it wasn't normal, because he also carried that moment like a wound that never completely healed. He told his wife years after marriage, on a night when the guilt became too heavy to carry alone. He told his children when they were old enough to understand. He told a few close friends who swore never to repeat it. And each time he told it, The story sounded more improbable, more fantastic, more like fiction than fact. People listened politely, and then changed the subject, their eyes betraying the skepticism their mouths didn't express. Charlie began to doubt his own memories. Perhaps the intelligence officers were right. Perhaps it was just combat shock, trauma-induced hallucination. Perhaps the German pilot had never existed. But then he looked at the photographs of Ye Old Pub, that destroyed fuselage, those impossible holes, that machine that shouldn't have flown. And he knew it had happened. Every bullet hole was evidence. Every piece of twisted metal was testimony. Decades passed. 1950, 60, 70, 80. World War II became history, then became distant memory, finally began transforming into myth. Veterans aged, their stories being lost one by one as they departed. Charlie Brown became an old man, Franz Stigler too, both carrying the same secret on opposite sides of the world, without imagining the other was still alive, still remembering, still wondering. And then, in 1986, 44 years after that impossible day, something changed. Charlie Brown, now 65 years old, read an article about World War II veterans looking for old war comrades. Something clicked in his mind. A crazy idea, desperate, probably useless. What if the German pilot was still alive? What if he also remembered? What if, after all these decades, it were possible to find answers? Charlie Brown made a decision. He would break the silence. It didn't matter if no one believed. It didn't matter if it seemed like madness. He needed to know, needed to find that man, needed to look into the eyes of the person who had saved his life and say, finally, thank you. But finding a German pilot without a name, without a serial number, without any information beyond a vague memory from 44 years ago, it was like looking for a ghost, and ghosts, as everyone knows, rarely want to be found. Charlie Brown sat before the typewriter and began drafting the most important letter of his life. Each word was carefully chosen, aware that it sounded absolutely insane. Seeking a German pilot who escorted my bomber over the North Sea in December 1942. He was flying a Messerschmitt 109. He saved us. Charlie reread the lines. It sounded like science fiction. It sounded like fantasy. It sounded exactly like what it was. The absolute truth. He sent the letter to a Luftwaffe veterans magazine published in Germany. The chances of a response were astronomical. First, the pilot needed to be alive. Unlikely after 44 years. Second, he needed to subscribe to that specific magazine. Even more unlikely. Third, he needed to remember one incident among thousands of combat flights. And fourth, most unlikely of all, he needed to want to respond, publicly admit an act that technically constituted treason. Charlie didn't expect a response. He had done his part, broken the silence, tried. The rest was beyond his control. Weeks passed. Nothing. 1 month. Nothing. 2 months. Charlie began to accept that the ghost would remain a ghost. And then, on an ordinary January day in 1987, a letter arrived. International envelope. Sender, Franz Stigler, Vancouver, Canada. Charlie's hands trembled so much he could barely open the envelope. The letter inside was written in careful English, each word carrying the weight of decades of silence finally broken. Dear Charles, I read your letter in the magazine and almost fell off my chair. I am the pilot you're looking for. I remember everything, the shattered bomber, your refusal to land, the escort to the sea. For 44 years I wondered if you survived. Now I know, and I can't describe what this means to me. Charlie read and reread the letter 10, 20, 30 times. It wasn't hallucination. It wasn't fantasy. It was real. The ghost had a name, had an address, had a voice. Charlie picked up the phone with trembling fingers and dialed the international number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, unmistakable German accent but speaking fluent English. Hello? Franz? Charlie's voice was choked. It's me, Charlie Brown, the bomber pilot. Silence on the other end, then a sound that could be laughter or crying or both. My God, you're alive. 2 old men, separated by a continent, connected by a fragile telephone wire, cried together. They cried for all the decades of silence. They cried for the weight finally lifted. They cried because the universe, against all odds, had given them this impossible moment of reunion. 6 months later, Charlie Brown flew to Vancouver. At the airport, among hundreds of unknown faces, 2 eyes, beat, instant recognition, impossible and absolute. They embraced right there in the crowded terminal. 2 old warriors who had been enemies for 5 minutes and brothers forever. Franz was now 67 years old, white hair, back slightly bent by time. But his eyes still carried that intensity Charlie remembered seeing through the cockpit glass 45 years earlier. They were no longer eyes of war. They were eyes that had seen too much, carried too much, silenced too much. They sat in a cafe near the airport, and for the first time since that impossible day in December 1942, they shared their versions of the same story. Franz described the moment he saw the shattered bomber, and how every military instinct screamed to squeeze the trigger. He described Gustav Rodel's voice echoing in his mind, that code of honor that separated soldiers from assassins. He described the terror of choosing compassion over duty, knowing it could cost his life. Charlie, in turn, described the horror of that return flight. Each minute an eternity, each second waiting for the final burst that never came. He described the confusion of seeing the enemy fighter not attacking, but protecting. He described 45 years of carrying a story no one believed, a debt he couldn't pay, a name he didn't know. Why did you do it? Charlie finally asked the question that had haunted him for decades. Why didn't you shoot? Franz was silent for a long moment, looking at his old hands resting on the table, hands that had held flight controls, that had squeezed triggers, that had taken lives. Because you were already dead, he said finally. Or at least that's what it seemed. Shooting you wouldn't be winning a battle. It would be killing wounded men. And I was raised to be a soldier, not an executioner. He paused, choosing the next words carefully. But there was something more. When I looked at you through those holes in the fuselage, I saw my brother. He was a bomber pilot. He was shot down over Russia in 1940. I wasn't there to save him. But that day over the North Sea, perhaps I could save someone else's brother. Charlie felt tears running down his face and made no effort to hide them. You saved 10 men that day, 10 lives, 10 families. My children exist because you made that choice. My grandchildren exist because you chose to be human when it would have been easier not to be. In the following days, Charlie and Franz were inseparable. 2 former enemies now united by something deeper than friendship. Brothers forged not by blood, but by a moment of impossible grace amid hell. They visited aviation museums together, observing the same types of planes they had flown on opposite sides of the war. A restored B-17 at the Seattle Museum of Flight made both stop in silence. Franz touched the aluminum fuselage with reverence, as if touching a sacred altar. "It's so fragile," he murmured. "How did you keep that thing in the air?" Charlie laughed without humor. Pure stubbornness, and maybe a German guardian angel. But not everything was peaceful reconciliation and emotional tears. There were complexities, nuances that the simple redemption story couldn't completely capture. One evening during dinner, Franz admitted something he had carried as secret shame. "You need to understand, Charlie. I wasn't a saint. Before that day, I had shot down 16 aircraft. 16, each one had crew, men like you, and I killed them without hesitation, because it was my job, my duty." He looked directly into Charlie's eyes. "I didn't save you because I was a pacifist or because I opposed the war. I saved you because in that specific moment, in that specific situation, killing you would have crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross. But the next day, if I had encountered another bomber in fighting condition, I would have shot without thinking twice." Charlie processed this in silence. It was uncomfortable. It was honest. It was the complex truth that simplified war narratives always try to avoid. "I understand," he said finally. "You were a soldier, I was too. We both killed. We both followed orders. We both did terrible things in the name of causes we believed were just. But that day, for reasons perhaps neither of us completely understand, you chose something different. And that counts. That matters. Franz told about the price of his choice. How he never received the Ritterkreuz despite sufficient merits. How certain officers treated him with inexplicable coldness in the war's final years. How he lived decades with the persistent fear that the truth would emerge and destroy the life he had built in Canada. I never regretted it, he said, but it was lonely. Carrying a secret like that for so many years. Constantly questioning if it was real or if my memory had distorted everything. You were the only one who could confirm. And I had no idea if you were alive or dead. Charlie shared his own weight. How the intelligence officers made him suppress the story. How he was treated with veiled suspicion whenever he mentioned the incident. How his crew gradually stopped talking about it. As if by tacit agreement, everyone decided it was easier to forget than try to understand. War has no room for nuance, Charlie said. Everything is black and white. Us against them. Good against evil. When something doesn't fit that narrative, it's easier to bury than confront. Because if an enemy can show mercy, if war has moments of humanity, then the entire moral edifice supporting the war effort begins to crack. It was a brutal truth, and both recognized it. Their stories had been suppressed not by malicious conspiracy, but because they were inconvenient. Because they forced questions no one wanted to answer. Because they reminded everyone that even in war, even in the worst of humanity, something inexplicably good could emerge. That first reunion in 1987 wasn't the end, but the beginning. Charlie and Franz became inseparable in the following years. They visited each other regularly, spent vacations together with their families, talked on the phone weekly. Their wives developed their own friendship. Their children grew up knowing the uncle from the other side of the old battle line. The families blended in ways that defied history's logic. Charlie's son and Franz's daughter developed deep correspondence about their experiences growing up in the shadow of their father's war. Grandchildren played together, ignorant and beautifully oblivious to the fact that their grandfathers had been trained to kill each other. But the story was still buried, known only to a small circle of family and close friends. Franz and Charlie spoke vaguely about sharing it publicly, but something held them back. Perhaps fear that the world wouldn't understand. Perhaps concern that the media would sensationalize it. Perhaps simple desire to keep something precious just for themselves. Then in 1990, an aviation historian named Adam Makos heard rumors about two veterans with an extraordinary story. He sought them out, initially skeptical, another war myth embellished by memory and time. But when he sat with Charlie and Franz, when he saw the documentary evidence, when he witnessed the genuine connection between them, he realized he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Makos spent years meticulously researching every detail. He verified military records from both sides. He found survivors from Ye Olde pub's crew who confirmed every element of Charlie's story. He located German mechanics who remembered Franz taking off precipitously that day. Piece by piece, he reconstructed not just the event, but the complete context, the lives before, the consequences after. The weight of silence carried. The resulting book, A Higher Call, was published years later. But during the research process, Charlie and Franz finally went public. They began giving lectures together at schools, museums, veteran events. Always together, always side by side. Two halves of a story that only made sense when told in unison. The reactions were intense and varied. Many veterans, especially those who had lost comrades in the war, struggled to accept the story. How could they celebrate a German pilot who killed allies just because he once showed mercy? Wasn't it betrayal of the memory of the dead? Charlie faced these questions directly at a particularly tense lecture. An elderly veteran, tears streaming down his face, asked, "My brother was shot down by a German pilot. How can you call your enemy a brother when my blood brother was killed by theirs?" The silence in the room was absolute. Charlie took a deep breath. "I don't forget the men we lost. I flew with them. I saw them die, and part of me still carries them. But Franz didn't kill your brother. Franz saved my life. These two truths coexist. War is big enough to contain both. And if we can't recognize humanity, even in those who fought against us, then war truly won. Franz beside him added, I don't ask forgiveness for the men I shot down. They were acts of war, and I carry them. But I also carry this act of not killing. Both define me. I was the pilot who shot down 16 planes, and the pilot who spared the 17th. Both are truth. Both are me. The years passed, and Charlie and Franz aged together. No longer as warriors, but as living witnesses of something the world desperately needed to understand. That even in the deepest darkness, sparks of light persist. They became involuntary symbols of reconciliation, forgiveness, and preserved humanity. But they were more than symbols. They were real men, with real flaws, carrying real weights. Franz had nightmares until the end of his days. Not just about that day that made him famous, but about the other days. The days when he had squeezed the trigger. Charlie carried survivor's guilt, questioning why he had been spared when so many others weren't. They talked about it in late-night conversations, when the cameras were off and the books closed. Raw and honest conversations about the real cost of being men in impossible times. Franz once confessed, "Some nights I wake up wondering if I made the right choice. Not about saving you, that I never question, but about all the other times. All the times I could have chosen differently and didn't." Charlie had no easy answers. No one did. "We did what we did," he said. "We can't change it, we can only witness, tell the complicated truth, and hope the next generations are wiser than we were." They visited schools together, speaking to teenagers who saw World War II as ancient and irrelevant history. But when these two old men told their story, something changed in the room. The young people leaned forward. Cell phones were forgotten. Because it wasn't history, it was humanity, distilled to its purest essence. A student once asked, "If you could send a message to who you were during the war, what would you say?" Franz and Charlie exchanged glances. Charlie answered first. "I would tell young Charlie Brown that that enemy he was trained to hate is just another man, scared like him, doing the best he can in impossible circumstances, and that one day, God willing, they would become friends." Franz nodded in agreement. "And I would tell young Franz Stiegler that honor isn't in how many enemies you kill, but in how many times you choose to be human when it would be easier not to be. That knight's cross he pursues isn't worth anything compared to being able to look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back." In 2008, more than 60 years after that day over the North Sea, Charlie Brown died at 87 years old. Franz Stiegler was at his side. They had been friends longer than they had been enemies. The last thing Charlie said, according to his family, was, "Thank you, brother, for everything." Franz survived a few more months. After Charlie's death, something in him seemed to surrender. As if his mission were complete, as if that last thread tying him to this world had been gently cut. He died peacefully in March 2008, at 88 years old. They were buried on opposite sides of the continent from each other, but their families made sure the headstones carried the same inscription: "Brothers Beyond War." The story could end with their deaths, two old men who shared an extraordinary moment and then departed. But some stories refuse to die with their protagonists. Some stories become bigger than the lives that generated them. Today, decades after that impossible encounter in the skies of December 1942, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler continues to resonate, not just as an interesting historical anecdote, but as a mirror in which humanity can see itself, both its worst and its best. In classrooms around the world, teachers use their story to teach that enemies are artificial creations, that hatred is a choice, that even in the most extreme circumstances, compassion remains possible. On military bases, instructors use their story to illustrate that true honor sometimes means disobeying, that courage doesn't always come from pulling the trigger, but sometimes from choosing not to pull it. Ye Old Pub never flew again after that day. It was considered unrecoverable, too destroyed to be worth the repair effort, but pieces of it were preserved. A fragment of the perforated fuselage is at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, labeled simply, "Bomber that shouldn't have survived." Thousands of visitors pass by it annually, most without knowing the complete story. But some know, and for those, that piece of holed metal is more than an artifact. It's tangible evidence that miracles sometimes wear iron crosses. The Messerschmitt that Franz flew that day was destroyed later in the war. No piece survived. But in aviation museums, when visitors ask guides if there are notable stories about the Messerschmitts on display, Franz's story is often told. The fighter that didn't shoot, the predator that became protector, the war machine used for a few crucial minutes, not to destroy, but to preserve. There's something deeply human in our need for stories like this. We live in a world that constantly tells us that people are tribal, that we inevitably hate the other, that war brings out only our worst instincts. And then a story like this emerges, complicated, imperfect, but undeniably real, and challenges all those comfortable certainties. Franz and Charlie weren't saints. They were flawed men who did terrible things and noble things, sometimes on the same day. They killed in the name of causes they believed were just. They followed orders that today we recognize as morally dubious. They participated in a war that cost 50 million lives. But for a few minutes over the North Sea, they also transcended all of that. Not because they were special or enlightened, but because they chose. Franz chose not to shoot. Charlie chose to keep flying. Both chose, decades later, to seek each other out and transform a moment of war into a legacy of peace. The lesson isn't that war is noble, or that enemies always become friends. The lesson is more subtle and perhaps more important, that even in the worst that humanity creates, the best of humanity persists, that no ideology is strong enough to completely crush compassion, that no hatred is deep enough to make mercy impossible. Franz Stiegler flew 97 combat missions during World War II. In 96 of them, he was a fighter pilot fulfilling his duty. In one, just one among almost 100, he was something more. And that single mission defined his life more than all the others combined. Charlie Brown flew 30 missions over occupied Europe. In 29 of them, he was a bombardier doing his job. In one, he was a man in the last minutes of life who received an impossible gift, the mercy of his enemy. How many other stories like this exist, lost forever because the protagonists never reunited? How many other moments of humanity happened amid the inhumanity of war and remained untold, uncelebrated, unknown? Probably thousands, perhaps millions. But we have this one, documented, verified, witnessed. And it's enough. Enough to remember that you, reading or hearing this now, also face choices daily. Not choices between life and death, perhaps, but choices between compassion and indifference, between humanity and convenience, between doing what's right and doing what's easy. Franz Stiegler was milliseconds from squeezing the trigger that would have destroyed 10 lives. But something, perhaps memory of his dead brother, perhaps his commander's words, perhaps simply the sight of those wounded men, made him hesitate. And in that hesitation, in that infinitesimal space between impulse and action, humanity found an opening. You'll have your moments too, perhaps not as dramatic, perhaps not with lives hanging in the balance, but moments where choice will make a difference, where compassion will cost something but mean everything, where doing right will be difficult but necessary. In those hours, remember, 2 men in the skies over the North Sea, amid the most destructive war humanity ever waged, found a way to choose humanity over hatred. If they could, in such extreme circumstances, then you can too. We all can. That's the final promise of the story. Not that we'll be perfect, not that we'll never fail, but that even when we fail, even when the world conspires to transform us into monsters, something essentially human persists. And sometimes, if we're lucky and brave enough, we manage to grab hold of that and hold tight. Franz and Charlie held on, for a few minutes over a hostile sea, and then for the rest of their lives. And now their story holds us, reminding, insisting, whispering through the decades You are more than your worst circumstances. You are more than your worst day. You are capable of impossible goodness. All you need is to choose.